The big stuff tends to get a lot of attention in writing. Expansive worlds, years long plots, larger than life characters, cats messing with the position of your lighting. But these macro elements alone are often not enough to make good fiction. For that, we need to go below the surface and look at the much smaller things these authors are doing. I think one of the reasons it's hard to make a great novel by just sort of parodying what another great novel does is because the real magic of a lot of great novels happens at the micro level rather than the more visible macro level. You can write something that's derivative and not very engaging, but appears on the surface to do everything that an engaging, really well written novel does. One story is great, one is derivative and not that engaging because one of them doesn't deal with the micro elements that go into writing good fiction. Today, I want to explore some of these micro elements of good fiction and how you can incorporate them into your own work. The tiny little things that separate great work from mediocre work. First off, micro elements tend to be the elements that engage emotions, whereas macro elements tend to engage the reader on an intellectual level. Readers in general, I think, tend to be more aware of the intellectual level engagement more so than the emotional engagement, which is why macro elements are what people notice and tend to focus on. Take something like world building. Any author who's built like a big fantasy world does a lot of things that engage the reader on an intellectual level. When you read Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive or whatever, you get introduced to this massive scope of the world on an intellectual level through all the different empires and place names and peoples and magic and places and gods and whatnot. But the writing also creates this emotional feeling of expansiveness that gets triggered, and that happens with smaller details. Differences in character names or little dialect things, little nuances that are built into the world. It's not just about having a world with tons and tons of stuff in it. It's about communicating the expansiveness and the depth to the reader, which tends to happen with smaller details. These are harder to pin down, and it was really a struggle to try to find examples of specific things that sort of trigger this feeling because, again, a lot of these small micro things tend to engage on an emotional level. But this is what works to create that immersive feeling, which is what you want if you're doing something like building a big fantasy world. You can try to copy this by building a big world with a bunch of made-up countries and whatnot, but if the writing lacks these little subtle details that make the reader feel like this is an expansive world, then it won't feel like an expansive world. Emotional reactions to specific small moments in a novel can also have an effect that lasts for a much longer time through that novel. There are plenty of tiny little micro things or moments within the writing that stir up emotion in the reader. These little moments can define an entire novel or define an entire character. This is often how tone and mood are conveyed. It's through these singular, tiny, small moments rather than the bigger macro elements that take up most of a novel. Strong impressions can last through an entire story and define how a reader feels about a plot or a character. There's a character in John Steinbeck's East of Eden named Kathy Ames, who is evil, let's just say. It probably goes beyond that, but that's a good place to start. She is also missing her back teeth, and there's a scene where another character is watching her eat, and they describe this unsettling feeling when watching her chew with her front teeth. But reading that tiny little moment in that story really solidified how I felt about Kathy's character for the rest of the novel. There's plenty of things that character does, plenty of bigger moments throughout East of Eden that establish her as a very evil character. More than any of the other big stuff that Kathy does throughout the rest of that novel, more than anything else that's done to establish that character as evil, the moment where another character describes how they feel unsettled watching her chew with her front teeth did more than any of that to establish what that character is about in my mind. I think that the quality and engagement of your story will be largely determined by how you manage these tiny moments. A reader is unlikely to remember all of the 15 scenes that establish who a character is, but they will remember tiny, profound moments that define the character for them. This could be how a character lights a cigarette, it could be a single line of dialogue, it could be a single thought that they have. Don't underestimate the power of these singular tiny moments in defining your characters. These moments can have effects that last for an entire novel. Another thing about these micro elements is they tend to come out of the interaction between story elements rather than the elements themselves. Whether it's tension between two characters or conflict or suspense, there's a lot of subtle but powerful story elements that happen when two or more ideas are combined. In Joe Abercrombie's Age of Madness series, there's two main characters who are married, and their relationship basically degrades throughout the course of that series. And there are so many subtle things in the interactions between those two characters and how their different viewpoints sort of collide, and all of this conflict and tension that occurs because of the differences in these two characters. And a lot of this is very subtle. This is an example of taking two big elements of a story, two of the main characters, and rubbing them together to create excellent conflict in a very subtle way, but that subtle conflict has a major impact on the story. I think one really good demarcation between good writers and bad writers is that good writers focus on the interactions between story elements, whereas bad writers focus more on the elements themselves. A lot of these interactions are more subtle, but as I've talked about throughout this video, they can have a big impact. Another very common example of this that's also very specific is unlikable seeming characters that are actually likable. These are your anti-heroes or otherwise morally gray characters that from the outside seem like the reader shouldn't like them, but the reader ends up liking them, often because of subtle things that the author is doing. A lot of writers try to make morally gray anti-hero type characters, and they just come across as annoying a-holes because those writers aren't doing a lot of the subtle things that make these characters work. A gritty anti-hero becomes an insufferable Mary Sue or Gary Stu quite easily. A lot of writers fail at writing good, unlikable characters because they miss subtle things like the character always punching up, or having some kind of sympathy-inducing elements in their backstory, or having interactions with other more dislikable characters who don't like them, those sorts of things. If you want to write a good anti-hero or morally gray character or whatever you want to describe them as, doing that is going to come down to how you handle these subtle, small details. Another critical micro element of writing has to do with your prose. This is kind of a different concept than the story elements that we've been talking about thus far, but there are all kinds of little prose and grammar related things that have an outsized impact on how the reader receives a work. Sentences that flow with clear meaning, good use of white space, managing punctuation like commas and semicolons, all of this contributes to how easily a novel is read, and all of these are really tiny little things. I don't know how in tune the average reader is with the quality of prose. I think that most people, if they encounter a book that's poorly written, they'll blame the plot or the characters. They'll say that those were the things that they weren't really interested in. But in actuality, there's little tiny problems in the prose that are on a subconscious or an unconscious level, making the reader not enjoy the book, because these little problems with the prose make it harder to connect with the characters and the plot. It makes it harder to understand what the author is trying to convey because the prose isn't as clear as it could be. If your prose isn't good, then your ideas won't be clearly communicated to the reader, even if the underlying ideas of the story are good, and a lot of the common prose problems are very small. Speaking of things that are very small, my conclusion to this video is very small because I didn't really write one. Anyway, if there are any small things that you find can make a novel great, then please share them in the comments down below. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.